He wrote, "God had a plan for me. He wants me in prison. This is His will, just like it was His will for Jesus to die for us." That sentence was written in October 2025. It was written by a man who is 40 years old, who works as a custodian at a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, who will never be released, who murdered his pregnant wife and his 2 daughters in August 2018. The sentence was published in January 2026 by the Daily Mail from a letter Chris Watts sent to a woman named Deborah. That is the data. Now here is the analytical problem. Chris Watts has admitted in verified letters reported by Inside Edition in June 2021 that he planned those murders over the course of several weeks. He admitted he secretly administered oxycodone to his wife in an attempt to end her pregnancy. He admitted he tried to end his daughters' lives at home before driving them to the oil site. The medical examiner's toxicology report confirmed the oxycodone in Shannan's system. These are admissions corroborated by forensic evidence. A person who planned murders over several weeks and then compared his imprisonment to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is not exhibiting grief. He is exhibiting something else. And what he is exhibiting follows a specific identifiable pattern that predates his incarceration, that has been documented in the months before August 13, 2018, and that is continuing in 2026 in the same structural form it has always taken. The analytical question is not whether Chris Watts feels remorse. The question is whether the behavioral pattern documented in his prison letters is the same behavioral pattern documented in the months before the murders. And if it is, what that continuity tells us about the nature of what happened in August 2018. The answer from the verified documentary record is that the patterns are identical. Same architecture, different setting, 7 years later. Here is the verified record, stated without editorializing. August 13, 2018, 3 people died in Frederick, Colorado. Shannan Watts, 34 years old, 15 weeks pregnant with a son who would have been named Nico. Bella Watts, 4 years old. Celeste Watts, 3 years old. November 19, 2018. Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Chris Watts to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 48 years, plus 36 years. He stated it was perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime he had handled in 17 years on the bench. December 3, 2018, 14 days after sentencing. Chris Watts was transferred out of Colorado under an interstate compact agreement. The stated rationale from the Colorado Department of Corrections was the level of threat his presence created in Colorado facilities. Death threats, planned attacks from other inmates. The transfer was not for his protection, it was for the state's operational stability. December 5, 2018. Chris Watts arrived at Dodge Correctional Institution in Walpin, Wisconsin. Maximum security, built in 1851. Approximately 1,000 inmates. He has been there since. As of March 2026, he has been incarcerated for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. He is in general population, not protective custody. This was confirmed by the Wisconsin Department of Corrections in a 2024 statement to People magazine. He works as a custodian. His commissary income is between 25 and 75 cents per hour. A 2022 jail source speaking to People magazine confirmed that he spends that commissary money primarily on stamps and paper to write letters to women. Those letters are the evidentiary record this analysis examines. The logical problem: the letters document a man who describes himself as transformed, as a new creature in Christ, as someone who has accepted God's plan for his imprisonment. The letters also document a man who blames the women around him for his crimes, who describes his mistress using Old Testament language about harlots and the chamber of death, who implies his wife's personality contributed to the murders, and who maintains emotional and psychological relationships with multiple women simultaneously through sustained written correspondence. A person who is genuinely transformed and a person who is repeating the same behavioral patterns that preceded a triple murder cannot be the same person at the same time. The letters document which of those two descriptions is accurate. 4 elements of the prison behavior record do not fit the transformation narrative Chris Watts has constructed. The first, the blame architecture, has not changed. In verified letters reported by multiple outlets since 2020, Chris Watts has attributed the murders to the women around him. In a March 2020 letter, he quoted, Proverbs, the words of a harlot have brought me low. He was writing about Nicole Kessinger. According to Dylan Toman, in his former cellmate who spoke to the Daily Mail in 2024, Chris has repeatedly described Kessinger as the reason his family is dead, as someone who seduced him and manipulated him and led him away from the life he had. In letters to an entity he addresses as God, zip code unknown, Chris Watts wrote the following, published by the Daily Mail: "I was misled. I was tempted by a harlot. I was weak. I allowed myself to be fooled by an evil woman. She led me from the path of righteousness. I know that you will deal with her someday. She will be judged." He has also, in letters reviewed by investigators and reported across multiple outlets, described Shannan as domineering and self-absorbed and implied that her personality contributed to what happened. The analytical finding: a person who is claiming spiritual transformation while simultaneously distributing blame for premeditated murders to 2 women is not exhibiting transformation. He is exhibiting the same externalization of responsibility that characterized his behavior in the weeks before August 13th. He maintained an affair while presenting as a devoted husband. He planned murders while texting normally. He gave television interviews about his missing family while knowing what he had done. The capacity to hold a false narrative while maintaining an alternative internal reality was present before the murders. It is present in the letters. The second, the Jesus comparison is not isolated. The October 2025 letter, comparing his imprisonment to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, was reported by the Daily Mail as consistent with earlier patterns in his correspondence. In an August 2025 letter reported by NewsNation, Chris Watts wrote, "I am a new man. I am not the person who committed those horrible acts." He then cited 2 Corinthians 5:17. "If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. All things are become new." That's me, he wrote. I'm a new creature. The analytical finding: Scripture is being used to erase the record. 2 Corinthians 5:17 is a theological statement about regeneration. Its function in this context is to invoke a religious framework that permits the dismissal of prior acts as belonging to an old creature who no longer exists. If the old creature is gone, then the new creature is not accountable for what the old creature did. If God's plan required this imprisonment, then the man who committed the acts was following a divine script, rather than making premeditated decisions over several weeks. The comparison to Jesus Christ goes further. The crucifixion framework positions Chris Watts as a person who is suffering unjustly for a divine purpose, not as a person serving a sentence proportionate to what he chose to do. The suffering is reframed as sacred. The imprisonment is reframed as divine will, rather than legal consequence. This is not transformation. It is the spiritual vocabulary of transformation applied to the psychology of evasion. The third, the commissary spending pattern reveals where the psychological investment is. A custodian in a Wisconsin maximum security facility earns between 25 and 75 cents per hour. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, at the midpoint, produces roughly $80 per month. The 2022 People magazine jail source confirmed that Chris Watts spends that money on stamps and paper to write letters to women. Not food, not books, not hygiene items. Stamps and paper. The analytical finding: approximately $80 per month is a constrained resource. How a person in a constrained environment allocates limited resources reveals what they most value. A person in genuine spiritual contemplation and transformation allocates limited resources toward the contemplative project. A person whose psychological orientation is organized around relationships with women who provide emotional validation allocates limited resources toward maintaining those relationships. The stamps and paper allocation is consistent with what Dylan Toman described to the Daily Mail in 2024. He will talk to a girl, and she becomes his everything really fast. He becomes obsessed with a woman, and she becomes all he can think of, and he'll do whatever they ask him to do. The pattern is not new. It preceded the murders. It is documented in the record of how his relationship with Nicole Kessinger developed. Now, it is documented in prison commissary spending. The fourth, the admissions and the transformation narrative are structurally incompatible. In letters reported by Inside Edition in June 2021, Chris Watts admitted the following. He planned the murders over several weeks. He administered oxycodone to Shannan to attempt to end her pregnancy. He tried to end his daughter's lives at home before they woke up. He then took them to the oil site. He admitted all of this in letters, while also, in other letters, claiming transformation and directing blame at Nicole Kessinger and Shannan. A person who planned murders over several weeks and is genuinely transformed acknowledges the full scope of what they chose to do and accepts responsibility for each element of that choice. The June 2021 admissions exist alongside letters in which those same crimes are attributed to the influence of a harlot who led him from righteousness. The admissions and the blame narrative cannot both be true simultaneously. And either he made his own decisions over several weeks as he admitted, or he was led by someone else, as his letters claim. The letters are in direct contradiction with each other. The fifth, the family relationship record, tells a specific story about who is maintaining contact and why. In the immediate aftermath of Chris Watts' arrest, his parents Ronnie and Cindy Watts stood by him. They visited, they sent money. In a December 2018 interview with ABC's 2020, his mother Cindy Watts stated she believed Shannan was more capable of killing the children than the Chris, and suggested Shannan's personality contributed to the murders. The interview produced national outrage. Shannan's family, the Rucheks, were devastated. As the years passed, public support from the Watts family contracted. While no confirmed reports of complete estrangement exist in the public record, but the reduction in visible support is documented. Chris Watts' sister, Jamie Williams, has remained publicly silent. According to Dylan Toman, Chris frequently talks about how unfair his situation is, as if he is the victim. He complains about feeling abandoned. The analytical finding here is specific. A man who planned murders over several weeks, who administered oxycodone to his wife, who attempted to kill his daughters in their beds, is complaining about abandonment by the family that survived. The complaint positions him as a person who is owed loyalty rather than a person who destroyed the people who were loyal to him. That is not the psychological structure of accountability. It is the psychological structure of entitlement. It is the same structure that produced the belief, documented in the admissions, that eliminating his wife and children was a legitimate solution to the problem of being unable to have both his family and his affair partner simultaneously. 3 scenarios for what the prison letters are documenting. Scenario A. Chris Watts has genuinely changed through religious conversion, and the letters represent sincere expression of that change. In this scenario, the blame in the letters reflects a person's authentic religious interpretation of their own failure, using the specific language and framing of evangelical Christianity to understand why they made the choices they made. The scripture citations are expressions of genuine belief rather than manipulative deployment. The Jesus comparison is hyperbolic religious expression rather than a deliberate reframing of accountability. The letters to women reflect loneliness, isolation, and the basic human need for connection under profoundly constrained conditions. What this scenario explains: people in genuine crisis do convert religiously. Prison conversions are documented and some are authentic. The need for connection in long-term solitary or institutional confinement is a documented psychological reality. Where this scenario fails, it cannot reconcile the concurrent presence of blame, attribution, and transformation claims in the same body of letters. Genuine transformation in the evangelical framework that Chris Watts invokes specifically requires confession and accountability. The letters to God in which he describes Kessinger as a harlot who will be judged and implies Shannan's personality contributed to the murders are not compatible with the evangelical transformation framework he simultaneously claims. He is using the language of transformation while exhibiting the behavioral structure of continued blame distribution. The two cannot coexist if the transformation is genuine. Scenario B. Chris Watts has not changed and is consciously using religion as a manipulation tool to maintain access to women who provide him with emotional and material support. In this scenario, the religious vocabulary is a strategic deployment. It creates a narrative of redemption that is emotionally compelling for a specific type of person. The person who believes that even the most damaged individuals can be restored through faith. And the letters to Deborah represent a specific relationship cultivation technique. Create intimacy, invoke religious devotion as the reason for restraint, maintain the connection. The photos of Shannan and the girls on the cell wall serve the same strategic function. They are props that maintain the performance of grief. What this scenario explains: the commissary spending on stamps and paper, the sequential pattern of deep connection, followed by religious withdrawal and then re-engagement. Dylan Toman's observation that Chris becomes obsessed with a woman and then does whatever they ask. The fact that multiple women are being maintained simultaneously in a correspondence network. Where this scenario fails, it requires a level of sustained strategic calculation that exists in tension with the disorganized elements of the letters. Such as the letters to God at zip code unknown, which read as genuine emotional expression rather than calculated communication. A person engaged in pure strategic manipulation typically does not write letters to a recipient with no address. Scenario C. The behavior is neither purely strategic nor genuinely transformative, but represents the continuation of a specific psychological pattern that was never identified or treated. In this scenario, the obsessive attachment to women, the externalization of blame, the compartmentalization of contradictory self-narratives, and the maintenance of a public self separate from a private reality are not strategic choices. They are the functioning of a specific psychological structure that was present before August 2018 and that continues operating in its natural form within the constraints of incarceration. The religious vocabulary is genuinely integrated into this psychological structure, not as strategy, but as the specific language through which blame distribution is currently expressed. God is the new audience for what used to be expressed through behavior. What this scenario explains: why the letters contain both sincere-seeming religious expression and clear manipulation. Why the admissions about planning the murders coexist with attribution of the murders to external forces. Why the pattern of obsessive attachment to women continued in prison without apparent strategic calculation. Where this scenario leads analytically. Dr. Elena Deali. She's a licensed psychotherapist who wrote the first psychological exploration of the Watts case and who reviewed the discovery documents and conducted research with a criminal psychologist and a neuroscientist, concluded that Chris Watts exhibits significant covert narcissistic and psychopathic traits. Covert narcissism specifically produces the pattern this scenario describes: genuine investment in the self-narrative, genuine belief in the externalized blame, and genuine inability to perceive the contradiction between claiming transformation and maintaining the same behavioral structure. Three technical dimensions of the prison record that deserve analytical attention beyond the surface content of the letters. The first, what general population at Dodge reveals about the institutional assessment of risk. And Chris Watts is not in protective custody. He is in general population at a maximum security facility, housing approximately 1,000 inmates, including people who know exactly what he did to his daughters. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections confirmed this in their 2024 statement to People magazine. The institutional assessment implicit in that housing designation is specific. Protective custody is used for inmates whose safety cannot be adequately managed in general population. The assessment that Chris Watts can function in general population at Dodge means the institution has determined he can manage himself behaviorally in a high-risk environment. That assessment is consistent with what Dylan Toman described. Chris keeps his head down, doesn't start trouble, stays quiet. The behavioral presentation that allows general population functioning is the same behavioral presentation that allowed him to manage a double life, an affair alongside a functional marriage, before August 2018. The capacity to manage appearance in a socially complex environment is a specific skill. It was documented before the murders. It is documented by his continued general population. Status 7 years into a maximum security sentence. The second, what the Deborah correspondence reveals about the relationship architecture. The letters to Deborah published by the Daily Mail in January 2026 document a specific relational sequence. Deborah first wrote to Chris Watts in 2022. The correspondence developed over approximately 3 years. In October 2025, Chris Watts told her that he believed in a different time. I would have been able to be with you, but God has other plans for my life. That sentence performs a specific function. It introduces the possibility of romantic connection, maintains the emotional investment by confirming he would choose her if circumstances allowed, and then withdraws the explicit possibility under cover of religious framing. The woman receiving that sentence has been given enough to remain invested, denied enough to remain seeking, and offered a religious explanation that is emotionally satisfying and difficult to argue with. Dylan Toman, who observed this pattern directly as a cellmate, described it to the Daily Mail in these terms. He will talk to a girl and she becomes his everything really fast. He becomes obsessed with a woman and she becomes all he can think of, and he'll do whatever they ask him to do. The sequence documented in the Deborah letters, 3 years of building investment followed by a romantic withdrawal framed as divine, is consistent with Toman's observation. The pattern produces a sustained correspondence relationship from someone who cannot access Chris Watts physically, who sends letters and potentially money, and who maintains an emotional connection based on the belief that circumstances rather than character are the barrier. The third, what the photos on the wall mean against the documented admissions. Chris Watts keeps photographs of Shannan, Bella, and Celeste above his bunk. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections confirmed in 2019 that inmates are legally permitted to possess family photographs. A petition to remove them was denied. There are 2 framings for those photos. The grief framing, a man forced to look at the faces of the people he destroyed every morning, is being made to confront what he did. The photos are a form of involuntary accountability. The performance framing, proposed by Dylan Toman. The photos are maintained to support the narrative of a grieving husband and father. Any visitor, any pen pal, any corrections officer observing the cell sees someone who keeps his family present. The photos signal love, regret, loss. They are the cell's first impression. Against those 2 framings, the documented admissions in the June 2021 Inside Edition reporting need to be placed directly. In letters to a different pen pal, Chris Watts admitted he tried to end his daughter's lives in their beds at home before they woke up. And he then wrote, "I'm not sure how they woke back up, but they did." That sentence describes a man who attempted to kill his sleeping daughters, watched them wake up, and then made a second decision to take them to an oil site where he completed what he had begun. The sentence is not the expression of a single moment of crisis. It documents 2 separate decision points with time and awareness in between. The photos of Bella and Celeste are above the bunk of a man who wrote, "I'm not sure how they woke back up, but they did." Something specific about the June 2021 admission needs to be examined as an analytic event rather than simply as a confession. Chris Watts admitted in letters the following sequence. He planned the murders over several weeks. He secretly administered oxycodone to Shannan over a period of time to attempt to end her pregnancy. His stated reasoning was that if she lost the pregnancy, leaving her would be logistically easier. Then on August 13th, he attempted to end his daughter's lives while they were sleeping in their beds. They woke up. He took them to the oil site. He admitted all of this in letters to a pen pal, not to law enforcement, not to a therapist, not in a formal context with any legal implication. In letters to a woman who had been writing to him. The analytical question is not whether the admissions are true. The oxycodone admission is corroborated by the medical examiner's toxicology report, confirming oxycodone in Shannan's system. The analytical question is why these specific admissions were made to these specific people in this specific context. A person who is strategically managing their narrative does not typically volunteer the most operationally damning details of a premeditated murder to pen pals and unrecorded letters. The admissions about planning over weeks, about the oxycodone, about the attempted home smothering are details that serve no strategic purpose in a letter to a woman who is already corresponding with you. They are not exculpatory. They are not necessary for maintaining the relationship. They are incriminating in the most specific way possible, adding premeditation to premeditation, adding calculation to calculation. Why would someone admit those things? Dylan Toman provided one answer to the Daily Mail. He will do whatever they ask him to do. If the woman receiving the letters expressed a specific desire to understand what really happened, the admissions may be the product of the same psychological structure that produces the obsessive attachment, the compulsion to be fully known by the person who matters in that moment, the same structure that produced the affair, the same structure that produced the plan to eliminate the wife and children who were barriers to the new life, the same structure that is producing letters to Deborah in October 2025. The admissions are not anomalous in this behavioral frame. They are its logical product. The need to be fully seen by the woman who currently matters overrides the strategic cost of admitting premeditated planning. Here is what we know, distinguished from what we infer. We know Chris Watts planned the murders over several weeks. He admitted this in letters corroborated in part by the toxicology report. As we know, he is currently in general population at Dodge Correctional Institution. We know he works as a custodian. We know the Wisconsin DOC confirmed this. We know he keeps photos of his victims above his bunk. We know the DOC confirmed this and upheld it legally. We know he spends his commissary money on stamps and paper to write letters to women. The People magazine 2022 jail source confirmed this. We know he wrote letters to Deborah across 3 years. We know the October 2025 Jesus comparison letter exists and was published by the Daily Mail. We know the Proverbs letter from March 2020 attributing the murders to the influence of a harlot exists and has been reported. We know he has described Shannan as domineering in letters reviewed by investigators and reported by outlets. We know Dylan Toman, his former cellmate, they spoke to the Daily Mail in 2024 and described the obsessive attachment pattern, the general population behavior strategy of keeping his head down, and his belief that Chris uses the victim photos to maintain a performance of grief. We know Dr. Elena Deali, who wrote the first psychological exploration of the case using discovery documents and consultation with criminal psychologists and neuroscientists, concluded that Chris Watts exhibits significant narcissistic and psychopathic traits of the covert variety that allow surface presentation to diverge from underlying psychology. What we infer, that the behavioral pattern in the letters represents the same underlying psychological structure that produced the murders, not as repetition of violence, but as repetition of the architecture that made the violence possible. The compartmentalization, the obsessive attachment, the externalization of blame, the maintenance of mutually contradictory self-narratives. We cannot infer from the letters alone that Chris Watts will never experience genuine remorse. We can infer from the documented pattern that, as of March 2026, the evidence of genuine accountability is absent from the record that exists. There is a specific cognitive mechanism that explains why the letters to women work. Psychologists use the term hybristophilia to describe sexual or romantic attraction to persons who have committed serious crimes. The mechanism is more analytically complex than simple attraction to danger. In many documented cases, the women who write to convicted murderers are responding to a specific presentation. A man who is demonstrably capable of extreme violence, but who, may in the context of the letter, presents as reflective, emotionally available, spiritually engaged, and uniquely understanding of the recipient's own depth. The presentation Chris Watts offers in his letters combines specific elements: religious vocabulary that signals reflectiveness and spiritual maturity, emotional language that signals availability and depth, the romantic near-miss framing, "I would have been with you in another time," that signals desire while maintaining unreachability, implicit victimhood language, led astray, weak, misled, that positions him as someone whose capacity for harm was externally activated rather than internally generated. For a woman who has not studied the discovery record, who has not read the June 2021 admissions, who has not parsed the contradiction between claiming transformation and distributing blame in the same letter archive, the presentation in the individual letter can be compelling. The cognitive error is not stupidity. It is incomplete information combined with the natural human tendency to believe that people in genuine distress who express genuine vulnerability are being genuine about everything. The letters are genuine in some dimensions. The loneliness is real. The desire for connection is real. The religious investment may be real. The cognitive error is in concluding from the genuine elements that the entire presentation is accurate. Dylan Toman's observation from direct observation of the man every day provides the corrective data. He becomes obsessed with a woman and then does whatever they ask him to do. The obsession is genuine. The letters are genuine expressions of the obsession. What is not genuine is the transformation narrative that the letters perform alongside the obsession. Return to the October 2025 letter. God had a plan for me. He wants me in prison. This is His will, just like it was His will for Jesus to die for us. That sentence was written by a man who planned murders over several weeks, who administered oxycodone to his pregnant wife over a period of time in an attempt to cause a miscarriage, who attempted to end his daughter's lives while they slept, who found them awake, who drove them to an oil site, and who then gave television interviews about his missing family. That sequence of events is in the verified record. It is in the discovery documents. It is in the admissions Chris Watts himself made in letters. It is corroborated in part by the medical examiner. The person who did those things is now writing letters comparing his imprisonment to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The comparison either reflects a genuine but severely distorted perception of what happened and what he deserves, or it reflects a strategic deployment of religious language to present himself to women who write to him as someone who has been transformed by suffering rather than appropriately sentenced for choice. Dr. Deali's covert narcissism framework offers a third possibility that incorporates both. A person with that psychological structure genuinely believes the narrative they are constructing because the alternative, full accountability without externalized causation, is not accessible to their psychological architecture. The distortion is not strategic in the conventional sense. It is structural. What the record establishes, and what cannot be contested by any element of the current evidence, is the following. The behavioral pattern documented in the letters is the same pattern documented before August 2018. Obsessive attachment to women, maintenance of contradictory self-narratives simultaneously, externalization of blame to the people who were most proximate to the harm, presentation of the self as someone who is uniquely deep, uniquely understood, uniquely connected to the recipient of the current communication. That pattern produced a set of decisions that ended 4 lives. It is continuing in 2026 in its documented form. It instamps in paper and letters to women who do not have access to the full record that is archived in discovery documents in Colorado. The data records events. The letters construct narratives. They are not the same thing. Shannan Watts was 34. She was 15 weeks pregnant with a son she had planned to name Nico. She loved her daughters. She documented her family's life because she believed in it. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. Nico was never born. None of them will ever read the letters. None of them can offer a response to the October 2025 comparison to Jesus. The record they left is in the discovery documents, in the toxicology report that confirmed the oxycodone, in the photographs Shannan posted of her daughters and her life that she believed was real. Chris Watts is 40 years old. He has 36 more years, all at average life expectancy, to write those letters, to send them, to receive responses, to spend his custodian wages on stamps and paper. When the letters are examined against the record of what he admitted he did, the analytical conclusion is specific and has not changed across 7 years. He regrets the consequences. He does not demonstrate accountability for the choices. The data is precise. The narrative in the letters does not fit it. Tell me in the comments, does the pattern documented in the letters, the blame architecture, the religious framing, and the continued obsessive attachment to women represent what you expected from someone 7 years into a life sentence for these specific crimes? And what do you think is the more accurate reading of the photos above the bunk? Subscribe to the investigation room. The letters exist. As the discovery record exists, the gap between them is specific, documented, and not closing. This video was produced for informational purposes only. All facts stated as confirmed are sourced from the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. Public statements, the Daily Mail's January 2026 and 2024 reporting, People Magazine's 2022 reporting, Inside Edition's June 2021 reporting, News Nation's 2025 reporting, and Dylan Toman's on-record Daily Mail interview. Dr. Elena Deali's conclusions come from her book, My Daddy is a Hero. The oxycodone admission is corroborated by the medical examiner's toxicology report. The plea agreement and sentence are confirmed court records. Shannan Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and Nico Watts deserve to live. The letters say he is a new creature. The record says he is the same one.